This lesson is intended for BTEC Level 3 students, and we're going to be looking at personality and sports performance. How does personality affect sports performance? So 3 main aims. We're going to introduce the concept of personality. What does personality actually mean? We're going to look at a few personality theories, and then we're going to think about briefly how those theories apply to sport. So what is personality? Well, very simply, personality is the sum of the characteristics that make a person unique. We don't want too much more of a definition than that because different theorists do actually define it in different ways. So we'll stick with a simple one. It's the sum of the characteristics that make a person unique. Well, how do those things then affect performance in sport? What are the different impacts that a person's personality may have on their ability to perform or to perform well in sport? These are the theories we'll be looking at: Psychodynamic Theory, Trait Theory, Situational Approach, Interactional Approach, and Marten's Schematic View. First up then is Psychodynamic Theory, and this theory was put forward by Sigmund Freud, and he basically said that the personality is made up of both conscious and unconscious parts. And he came up with 3 areas of the personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, id stands for the instinctive drive, and that is at the unconscious level. These are basically responses that you make to something without thinking about it. So it doesn't pass through any kind of thought process, it's just kind of a gut reaction, if you like. The ego and the superego, though, are the 2 other parts of the personality which are not unconscious but are predominantly under conscious control. So these are responses, or these are the areas of the personality where responses are thought of and decided upon. That's the ego and the superego. The superego is different to the ego insofar that it is the moral conscience. So it informs and influences the ego. Once the ego decides upon the response, the superego will determine whether that is morally acceptable, will determine the rightness or the wrongness, if you like, of the response determined by the ego. So they work together in that regard. The next theory is trait theory. A trait is simply a stable internal characteristic of personality, so it is part of you. It is what makes up your personality, and it's very much internal. It's not affected by the environment. It's very stable and is relatively, if not always, consistent. So this theory, trait theory, suggests that it is your traits, that whatever situation you're put in, it's your natural internal characteristics that will determine your choice of behaviour in that situation, even if it's a new situation to you. One trait theory suggests that there are 2 continuums of traits. One is a continuum between an extroverted personality right across the scale to an introverted personality, and that all people fall somewhere on the scale between extrovert and introvert. The second continuum that's used in trait theory is the stable to neurotic continuum, which is a description of how consistent a person is in terms of the behaviours that they display based on their internal traits. So we've got 3 people here, 3 sports people, who obviously each one, according to trait theory at least, has a set of internal traits, and we want to place them on this diagram, on these 2 continuums, one from introvert to extrovert, going from left to right, and then from bottom to top we've got stable to unstable. So if we look first at Joey Barton, where do we think he will come? So Joey Barton's a fairly extroverted character, and in terms of his personality, he produces lots and lots of different types of behaviours. So we could potentially therefore say that he was a relatively unstable extrovert. What about Paula Radcliffe? I've decided that I'm going to put her over here, that her behaviours are relatively stable, her traits are relatively stable, and that she's essentially a pretty introverted character. Finally then we've got Ronnie O'Sullivan, suggest that he's probably more along the extroverted continuum, perhaps not quite so far as Jerry Marten is, and that maybe because he's a snooker player perhaps, and he's learned to control that extroversion, that he's relatively stable in terms of his traits. What about yourself? Where would you put yourself on these two continuums? Another approach to personality theory is situational approach. That basically one's behaviour is pretty much dependent on the situation that you're in rather than any internal traits. So if the situation is the key factor that determines how a person will behave, do you know anybody who exhibits that kind of change in behaviour depending on the situation? So do you know anyone who is a completely different person once they're on the field of play? Perhaps somebody who's shy and retiring and quiet when they're in college or at home, and then when they get on the football pitch or the rugby pitch or the hockey pitch is completely different, maybe shouts and balls, abuses the referee, those kinds of things. Do you know anybody who completely changes depending upon the situation that they've been put in? The next theory is interactional approach, and this really is a fusion of the theories we've looked at. So the fusion of trait theory and situational approach that takes the two theories and tries to make a combination of the two. So traits are acknowledged that a person has, if you like, inbuilt characteristics that are fairly stable and consistent, but also that those will be affected by the situation that you put a person in. So those two things together will be the things that determine the person's choice of behaviour. This is particularly important when a situational factor is a strong factor. So for example, what I mean by that is if you're in a situation which is particularly intense or pressurised, so for example a penalty shootout, the traits of a person may be subdued or even overcome, and their behaviours might then become less predictable, so be less likely to exhibit their normal patterns of behaviour if the situation or the factors in that situation are particularly strong. A type of interactional approach then would be Marten's schematic view. There's a diagram here of that view, which is taken from the BTEC Level 3 Sports Student Book, which shows that essentially there are three levels of personality or behaviour, if you like, that are interlinked. Internally, you've got the psychological core of a person, which essentially we would call traits, up to the top of the schema, where you've got role-related behaviour. That is, a person behaves in a particular way when in a certain role. So that role might be the captain of the team. Do they behave differently if they're the captain of the team compared to if they were just a player in any other position? So the closer or the more important or significant the social environment that person is put in, the more change you may see in the behaviours that they exhibit. So the core is most important in determining behaviour, which is why it's the widest on the diagram or on the schematic view. And that is relatively constant. It does change from time to time through age and so on, and other impacts, but essentially it's pretty constant. And then you have typical responses that in the majority of situations, that psychological core, those traits that are embedded there, will work themselves out in a particular way. You'll have typical responses in certain situations. But then right at the top of the Marten's schematic view, you'll see that the person has conscious control over their role-related behaviour. So they may have preferences for certain types of behaviour, but they are able to consciously control their behaviour, and so their role-related behaviour in any given situation is changeable. So that is a pretty good example of the fusion of different approaches to produce the interactional approach. One other theory is the personality types theory that suggests that there are two types of people, type A and type B. and type A exhibit the following characteristics. They're highly competitive, they have a strong desire to succeed, they work very quickly, they like to be in control, and because of those things they suffer a lot of stress. Type B, essentially the opposite. They're not really very competitive, they're not particularly ambitious, they like to work nice and slowly, they don't want to be in control, they like to be controlled, they like someone else to take control, and because of those things they're less prone to be stressed. Maybe these two personality types could explain to us why it is that some people do succeed in sport and others don't. Perhaps when sport becomes pressurized, when sport becomes highly competitive, it's a scenario where type A personalities can thrive, but type B personalities fall away and don't continue in those sports. Perhaps this is one way to explain why some people do succeed and others don't. So there we have it. Those are our aims, which I believe we've achieved. We've introduced the concept of personality, summarised a few of those theories on personality, and then thought briefly about how some of them apply to sport. Hope that's been helpful.